When I decided to camp alone in Uari National Forest, I thought I was being brave. The trip was supposed to be a turning point, an escape from the wreckage of my breakup, a chance to focus on my book. As a writer researching Appalachian folklore, I had spent months reading about witches, curses, and the eerie history of these woods. But nothing prepares you for the weight of silence when you're truly alone. The first 2 days were uneventful. I parked my RV in a small clearing near a trailhead and spent hours hiking and jotting notes. The forest was dense but beautiful, the kind of place that feels both timeless and untouched. Occasionally, I'd spot strange carvings on trees, symbols I didn't recognize, but they added a certain charm to the place. I even felt a spark of inspiration returning. On the third day, I met Caleb, a park ranger. He was older than me, gruff but friendly in that I've seen it all way. He stopped by my campsite to check on me. "Most people don't camp here alone," he said, his gaze lingering on my RV. "Not for long, anyway." "I like the quiet," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Quiet's not the only thing out here," he said. "These woods have a way of messing with people." I laughed, assuming he was trying to scare me. "You mean the witch stories?" Caleb's expression darkened. "Yeah, you've heard them then." I nodded. "A settler accused of witchcraft hanged by the locals. Supposedly cursed the forest before she died. It's a good story." "It's not just a story," Caleb said, his voice low. "People disappear out here, lose their way. If you see anything strange, anything, you leave. Got it?" His seriousness caught me off guard, but I nodded, muttering something about being careful. As he walked away, I noticed him glance over his shoulder, as if making sure I wasn't being followed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of crickets and owls, was eerily silent. The quiet pressed against my ears, making every creak of the RV seem deafening. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the RV. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against the metal. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The forest was pitch black, the beam of my light cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I saw it, a tree near my campsite, freshly carved with strange symbols. They weren't there earlier, I was sure of it. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. The air felt colder near the tree, my breath visible in the light. I backed away, suddenly desperate to be inside. The next morning, I found the symbols scratched into my RV door. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anything after going back inside, but someone, or something, had been there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was kids pulling a prank, though the nearest campsite was miles away. Determined to shake off the fear, I packed a bag and set out on a trail I hadn't explored yet. I marked my path with small flags to ensure I wouldn't get lost. But an hour in, I realized something was wrong. The forest felt different. The trees seemed denser, the air heavier. I should have reached the creek by now, but instead, I found myself back at the same marked tree from earlier. My flags were gone, replaced by more carvings. That's when I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer, faint voices calling my name. My pulse quickened as I turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. "Who's there?" I shouted. the whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence felt suffocating. Then a branch snapped behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught a shadow darting between the trees. It was too tall, too quick to be an animal. My breath hitched as I backed away, my foot catching on a root. I stumbled and fell, scraping my palms on the dirt. When I looked up, the shadow was gone. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting. I locked the doors and sat at the small table, staring at my notes. My research felt trivial now. What good were legends and old stories when something was actively stalking me? I thought about Caleb's warning. He'd said people disappeared, but he hadn't told me how to fight whatever was out there. My only clue was the symbols, their meaning still a mystery. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It circled the RV, moving from side to side. My flashlight flickered again, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. I sat frozen, clutching it like a lifeline. "Lisa." The voice was faint, almost familiar. My blood ran cold. It sounded like Caleb. "Lisa, help me." I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. "Caleb, is that you? Please, I'm hurt." The voice was closer now, desperate. I opened the door a crack, the cold air rushing in. "Where are you?" No one was there. The tapping resumed, this time on the roof of the RV. I slammed the door and locked it, my chest heaving. The lights inside flickered, then went out entirely. In the darkness, I heard the whisper again, closer than ever. "Help me." The next morning, I found a necklace on the RV table, a delicate silver chain with a small tarnished charm shaped like an eye. I didn't own it, and I hadn't brought it inside. My hands shook as I held it, the metal cold against my skin. Desperation drove me back into the forest. I retraced my steps, determined to find answers. That's when I saw it. A cabin, hidden among the trees. Its roof sagged and the windows were cracked, but smoke curled faintly from the chimney. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a single room cluttered with strange artifacts, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, crude dolls made of twigs, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. A journal lay open on the table, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. As I flipped through it, my stomach twisted. The entries described my movements in the forest, my thoughts, my fears. The last page read, "She comes to me willingly." The door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my back against the wall. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, its form shifting like smoke. Two hollow eyes stared at me, unblinking. "Who are you?" I whispered. The figure didn't answer. It stepped closer, its movements unnaturally fluid. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the necklace, holding it out like a shield. "Stay back!" I shouted. The figure hesitated, its gaze fixed on the charm. Realization struck. I remembered Caleb mentioning warding spells. This necklace was my only chance. I bolted out of the cabin, clutching the charm. The figure followed, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. The forest blurred around me as I ran, the ground shifting under my feet. Every trail led me back to the same cursed clearing, the symbols carved into the trees glowing faintly. In my final moments of terror, I made a decision. I pulled the journal from my bag and lit a match. The flames caught quickly, consuming the pages. The whispers turned into a deafening scream as the figure dissolved into ash, carried away by the wind. The forest fell silent. I made it out of Uari the next morning, guided by Caleb, who I found unconscious near the road. He didn't remember how he got there, but I didn't press him. We both knew better than to question the forest's mysteries. Back home, I placed the necklace in a drawer and locked it away. I finished my book, but the chapter on witches became a personal account, a warning to anyone who might follow in my footsteps. I don't camp alone anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the whisper of the forest in my dreams. Help me. The air smelled of damp leaves and pine, the kind of scent that takes you back to simpler times. For me, it was years ago, back when my wife, Laura, and I would spend weekends hiking and camping in places just like Lynville Gorge. But she was gone now, and all I had left was the wilderness. It was supposed to be a comfort. This trip was supposed to be about healing. Instead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I parked my RV in a secluded spot just off the trail to Table Rock. It wasn't a campground exactly, just a patch of dirt with a fire ring someone had left behind. Perfect. Solitude had been my goal, but the way the shadows clung to the trees as the sun dipped behind the ridge made me feel less alone than I wanted. The first person I met in the gorge was Derek. I'd just finished setting up camp when he sauntered over from a neighboring site, a hunting knife glinting at his hip. He was one of those guys who looked like he belonged out here. Scruffy beard, lean build, the kind of confidence that came from taking risks and getting away with it. "You camping alone?" he asked, his voice carrying just a little too much edge for my liking. "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Needed some quiet." Derek grinned. "Quiet's good, but it can mess with your head out here. You hear things, start thinking you're not alone. You know how it is." I nodded, but didn't reply. I didn't like the way his words hung in the air, like a warning wrapped in a joke. He stayed a while longer, bragging about some off-trail hike he'd done the day before and how he never needed a GPS. Eventually, he wandered off, leaving me with a vague sense of unease. Later that afternoon, I ran into Madison. She was perched on a rock near the trailhead, her map spread out across her lap, and her phone balanced precariously on her knee. She looked up and smiled as I approached. "Do you know if this trail loops back to the parking area?" she asked, gesturing to the map. "It does," I said, pointing to the spot, "but it's steep on the return. You might want to take the shorter route." "Thanks," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm not great with directions. Honestly, I'm more of a desk person. This is all for my thesis." "Thesis?" I asked, intrigued. She grinned. "Appalachian folklore. I'm researching legends tied to the gorge. Have you ever heard of the wraith?" I shook my head, though the name alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. "It's a ghost story," she continued. "They say it's the spirit of a miner who died in a cave-in, doomed to wander the gorge, luring hikers off the trail. Apparently, people hear whispers and see things that aren't there. Creepy, right?" "Sounds like it," I said, my voice a little too flat. She frowned slightly but didn't push. "Well, if you hear anything strange, let me know. I'd love to add some first-hand accounts to my research." That night, the forest felt different. The usual symphony of insects and distant owls had gone quiet, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it for the first time. A whisper. It was so faint I thought I'd imagined it, Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, softer this time, almost like it was coming from inside my head. "Caleb!" I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. My name. Someone had whispered my name. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods, but there was nothing there. Still, the whisper lingered, fading in and out like a broken radio signal. By the time I went to bed, the fire had burned down to embers and the whispering had stopped. But sleep didn't come easily. I dreamed of Laura, her voice calling me from the shadows, and woke to find the RV door ajar. My flashlight was sitting on the steps, even though I'd left it on the table. The next morning, I ran into Derek and Madison at the trailhead. Derek was talking animatedly about a hidden trail he'd found near an old mining shaft, while Madison listened with a mix of fascination and unease. "You should come with us," Derek said when he spotted me. "It's off the beaten path, but the views are worth it." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to decline, but curiosity won out. I wanted answers. About the whispers, about the feeling that something was watching me. Maybe this would help me make sense of it all. The trail Derek led us down wasn't a trail at all, just a faint path through the underbrush marked by claw-like scratches on the trees. Madison pointed them out, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "They look like handprints," she said, running her fingers over the grooves. "Like something was marking its territory." Derek shrugged. "Probably bears." But they didn't look like bear claws. The marks were too deliberate, too human. When we reached the mining shaft, the air seemed to change. It was colder here, and the smell of damp earth hung heavy in the air. The entrance was partially collapsed, a jagged hole barely big enough to crawl through. Madison crouched to take a picture, but Derek stopped her. "Careful," he said. "You don't want to wake anything up." I raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Derek's grin didn't reach his eyes. "Just a joke, man." But I wasn't laughing. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. They didn't just call my name. They accused me. "Why didn't you save me, Caleb?" The voice wasn't Laura's. It was male, deeper, anguished. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. It was the voice of the hiker I couldn't save. All those years ago when I was a ranger. A hiker who'd gone missing in a storm, whose body wasn't found until days later. "Why didn't you save me?" the voice repeated, growing louder. I stumbled outside, desperate to prove it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I stepped into the clearing, I saw it. The wraith. It stood at the edge of the trees, its gaunt, skeletal frame barely visible in the moonlight. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Caleb," it whispered, its voice layered and distorted, like multiple people speaking at once. I backed away, tripping over a root and falling hard on the ground. By the time I scrambled to my feet, it was gone. I found Madison the next morning, pale and shaking at her campsite. She'd seen it too. She showed me a picture she'd taken of the gorge. At least, it was supposed to be a picture of the gorge. Instead, it showed the faint silhouette of the wraith, hovering over the trees like a shadow. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." I agreed. But before we could pack up, Derek appeared, his face drawn and wild. "You're not going anywhere," he said, blocking the RV door. "Not until we finish this." "Finish what?" I demanded. He pointed toward the mining shaft. "It's there. The wraith. We have to confront it, or it'll never let us leave." "You're insane," Madison said, backing away. But Derek wouldn't listen. He pulled out his knife and started toward the shaft, daring us to follow. The mining shaft was even more oppressive in the daylight. The air was heavy, the silence suffocating. Derek led the way, his knife glinting in the dim light. Madison clung to my arm, her breathing shallow. The wraith appeared as soon as we entered the clearing. Its gaunt form seemed to melt out of the shadows, its glowing eyes locking onto each of us in turn. It whispered to Madison first, its voice soft and cruel. "You'll be forgotten. Your work means nothing." She fell to her knees, clutching her ears. Then it turned to Derek. "You can't hide. You can't escape what you've done." Derek screamed, charging at the wraith with his knife raised. But it didn't fight him. It simply opened its mouth wider than any human jaw could, and Derek froze, his scream cutting off abruptly. He collapsed to the ground, motionless. Finally, it turned to me. "Why didn't you save me?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. I wanted to run, to close my eyes and pretend this wasn't happening, but something inside me refused to give in. I pulled out my lighter and the bundle of sage I always carried, a ranger's trick for warding off bears, though it seemed absurd now. I lit the sage and held it out in front of me, the smoke curling toward the wraith. It hissed and recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Leave us alone," I said, my voice shaken but firm. The wraith hesitated, its eyes narrowing. Then, with a final, bone-chilling whisper, it vanished into the shadows. Madison and I didn't speak as we left the gorge. I dropped her off at the visitor center, where she promised to delete her research and never look back. I didn't blame her. As for me, I don't know if I'll ever return to Linville Gorge. But I do know one thing. The wraith wasn't just a ghost. It was hunger. A hunger for fear, for guilt, for the pain we carry. And it's still out there, waiting for its next meal. I didn't tell anyone I was heading to Uari National Forest. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, made as I stood in my kitchen surrounded by the echoes of my old life, wedding china and boxes, family photos half wrapped in bubble wrap. The divorce had left me with a suffocating need to escape. So, I packed up the RV, grabbed my camera, and hit the road, chasing the quiet promise of the woods. The Uari was perfect. Sprawling trails, a tranquil lake, and the kind of solitude I craved. I arrived just before sunset and stopped at a general store near the entrance to grab supplies. A bell jingled overhead as I walked in, and a woman behind the counter greeted me with an unsettlingly wide smile. "You camping alone?" she asked, her eyes lingering too long on my face. "Yeah, just for a couple of days," I replied, avoiding her gaze. She nodded, but her smile faltered. "Stick to the marked trails, honey. Folks say the forest gets peculiar off the beaten path." I tried to brush it off as small-town weirdness, but something in her tone stayed with me. I thanked her, paid for my snacks and firewood, and drove deeper into the forest. The campsite was beautiful, secluded with the lake shimmering under the fading light. I parked the RV near the water, grabbed my camera, and set out to catch the golden hour. The air was cool, the trees casting long shadows over the still surface of the lake. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. That was when I saw it. A shadow in the water's reflection. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably humanoid. I spun around, but there was no one there. just the empty woods and the whisper of wind through the trees. I laughed at myself. "You're just imagining things, Elena," I muttered. Still, I felt a twinge of unease as I returned to the RV. That night, I heard it for the first time, the knocking. It was faint, rhythmic, and seemed to move around the RV. I froze, my heart pounding. Buddy, my dog, would have barked if he were here. But Buddy was with my ex, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door. Nothing. Just the dark, quiet forest. The next morning, I decided to push the weirdness aside and focus on enjoying my trip. As I hiked along the lake's edge, my camera slung over my shoulder, I noticed something strange. Carvings on the trees. They were crude and shallow, resembling a child's handprints. I crouched down to inspect one, running my fingers over the rough edges. "Creepy, right?" a voice behind me said. I jumped, spinning around to find a man standing a few feet away. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and an easy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sorry," he said, raising his hands. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Brandon." "Elena," I replied, still catching my breath. "You camped out here?" He nodded. "Just passing through. The forest's got a reputation, you know." "For what?" He hesitated, glancing at the carvings. "Weird stuff. People see things out here. Shadows, lights, even hear voices. Local legends blame it on some burial ground deep in the woods." "Great," I said dryly. "And here I thought I was just here for the scenery." He laughed, but there was a tension in it. "You want to see something cool? There's a trail most people don't know about. It leads to this amazing overlook." Every instinct screamed at me to decline, but curiosity got the better of me. "Sure, lead the way." The trail was narrow and overgrown, the kind of path that felt like it hadn't seen another human in years. As we walked, Brandon pointed out more of the handprint carvings, which grew more frequent the deeper we went. He seemed uneasy, glancing over his shoulder every so often. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said quickly, "just this place gets under your skin." The overlook was breathtaking, though. The forest stretched out below us in a sea of green and gold, the lake glinting like a shard of glass in the distance. I raised my camera and snapped a few shots. When I lowered it, Brandon was staring at me. "You shouldn't have come here alone," he said quietly. "What?" Before he could answer, there was a sound, a high, lilting laugh like a child playing hide and seek. It came from the trees below. Brandon's face went pale. "We need to go," he said, grabbing my arm. "Now." Back at the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I checked the photos I'd taken, hoping the distraction would help, but instead, it made my stomach drop. In every shot, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a small child standing in the shadows. I slammed my laptop shut and turned to find Brandon standing at the door. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked. "What's going on?" I demanded. "What's out there?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the forest. "They call it the Shadow Child. No one knows what it is, but it's tied to those carvings. It lures people deeper into the woods, and they don't come back." "Why are you still here?" I asked, suspicion creeping in. He looked away. "I've been trying to stop it, to find where it's buried, break whatever hold it has, but it won't let me leave until someone else takes my place." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "You brought me here on purpose." "I didn't have a choice," he snapped. "It's either you or me." That night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. I didn't sleep, clutching a flashlight and knife as if they'd do anything against whatever was out there. Around 2 a.m., I heard the laughter again, closer this time. "Stay inside," Brandon whispered. He stood by the door, a knife in hand, his face grim. "If it gets in, we're done." "Gets in?" I hissed. "What are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he stared out the window, his expression haunted. And then I saw it. A small figure, barely visible in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the forest. Its head tilted as if curious. It took a step forward, then another, until it was close enough that I could see its face, or rather the lack of one. Its features were a smudge of shadow, shifting and swirling like smoke. "Elena," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. The sound slithered into my ears, cold and hollow. "Come play." I didn't remember grabbing the camera, but suddenly I had it in my hands. The flash went off, lighting up the dark. The child recoiled, its shadowy form flickering like a flame in the wind. "Use the light," Brandon shouted. I hit the flash again, then again, each burst pushing the thing back. It let out a wail that shook the RV, and I felt the floor vibrate beneath me. "Now," Brandon yelled, "run!" We bolted into the forest, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear it behind us, its footsteps impossibly light but fast. The laughter turned into a scream, sharp and furious, and I felt something cold graze my arm. Brandon grabbed my hand and yanked me forward. "This way, it won't follow past the lake." We broke through the tree line, the lake reflecting the moon like a giant mirror. The shadow child stopped at the edge, its head tilting as it watched us. It didn't step forward, but its laughter echoed in my ears long after it disappeared. By morning, Brandon was gone. I don't know if he made it out, or if the forest finally claimed him. I didn't wait to find out. I drove until the forest was a distant memory in my rearview mirror. But even now, safe in my apartment, I feel its presence. In reflections, in shadows, I see it, watching, waiting. And sometimes I hear the laughter. I wasn't thrilled about camping at the Devil's Tramping Ground. The name alone sounded like something cooked up for tourists or thrill seekers, not a place you'd actually want to spend a night. But Katie was relentless, and if there was one thing my best friend was good at, it was wearing people down. "This will be great for the podcast," she said for the 100th time as I guided the RV down a narrow dirt road. "Think about it, Mitch. Devil's Tramping Ground, myth or menace. It practically writes itself." "Yeah, until we're the ones on the news for disappearing," I muttered. "Relax," Katie laughed, leaning over the console to show me a map on her phone. "It's just a patch of dirt. The scariest thing out here is probably a coyote." "Tell that to Buddy," Tasha, my girlfriend, chimed in from the back. She was scratching behind our mutt's ears, trying to calm him down. Buddy had been restless since we hit the forest, whining and pawing at the door like he wanted out. Not normal for a dog who loved road trips. Adam, Katie's boyfriend, groaned from the table where he was fiddling with his laptop. "Can we just agree this is a terrible idea? I don't even like camping, and now we're camping at a place literally called Devil's Tramping Ground. You guys better not expect me to get out and ghost hunt or whatever." "Noted," Katie said, clearly ignoring him. "We're almost there." I gripped the wheel tighter as the road narrowed further, the trees closing in like an ominous tunnel. The last sunlight filtered through the branches, and I felt the first pangs of unease. I didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about this place that felt wrong. When we reached the clearing, Katie practically bounded out of the RV, dragging Adam behind her. "Come on, Tasha, Mitch, you've got to see this." The infamous circle wasn't much to look at. A barren patch of earth about 40 feet across, with no grass, weeds, or even moss growing on it. It was surrounded by thick trees that leaned inward, as though the forest itself was trying to keep something contained. The air inside the circle felt heavier somehow, and Buddy refused to go near it, barking and tugging on his leash. "Animals always avoid it," Katie said, grinning like a kid on Christmas. "Legend says the devil himself walks here every night, pacing in circles as he plots evil deeds. Isn't that awesome?" "Awesome's not the word I'd use," Tasha murmured, eyeing the circle warily. "It's just dead soil," I said, crouching to touch the ground. It was hard and dry like old clay. Probably something to do with the pH levels. Nothing mysterious about it. Katie snapped pictures, her enthusiasm undeterred. "Come on, Mitch. You can't tell me you're not a little intrigued." "Not really," I lied, standing up and brushing off my hands. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark." We parked the RV just outside the circle, close enough to see it, but far enough that even Katie wouldn't argue about pitching a tent inside. The fire crackled warmly as night fell, and we started to settle in. Adam, surprisingly, had loosened up, cracking jokes about how we were all going to end up on some true crime podcast. But the unease didn't leave me. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Even Buddy had gone silent, lying pressed against Tasha's legs as if afraid to move. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was letting Katie's stories get to me. Then we heard the footsteps. It started as a soft crunch of leaves, distant enough that I almost didn't notice. But they grew louder, steady and deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, scanning the trees. Nothing. "Did you hear that?" Tasha asked, clutching Buddy's leash. "Probably a deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Stay by the fire." I stepped closer to the edge of the circle, shining my flashlight into the dark. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows, yet the footsteps didn't stop. They just shifted, moving further into the woods, and then closer again, always out of sight. "Mitch?" Katie called. Her voice wavered, and for the first time she sounded unsure. "What do you see?" "Nothing," I lied again, lowering the flashlight. "It's probably just animals." But the footsteps didn't sound like animals. They sounded like something walking on two legs, pacing just beyond the reach of the firelight. By the time we retreated to the RV, the mood had soured. Adam was on edge, Katie was unusually quiet, and Tasha looked ready to leave. Even Buddy was trembling, his ears flat against his head. But what really got to me was the circle. It looked different. I couldn't explain it, but the edges seemed sharper, the dirt darker, as though the ground itself was watching us. Inside the RV, we tried to shake it off. Adam put on a movie, Katie poured drinks, and we all pretended not to notice the occasional thud against the walls. Buddy barked at the door once, but when I opened it, there was nothing there. I finally let myself relax a little, leaning back in the driver's seat. Then Katie screamed. Her camera was gone. She swore she'd left it on the table, but now it was missing. I searched the RV while the others stayed huddled together, my pulse quickening. Then I found it, sitting dead center in the tramping ground, its lens pointed straight at us. Very funny, I said, holding it up when I came back. Who put this out there? No one answered. Katie looked pale, Adam shook his head, and Tasha's eyes darted to the window. Mitch, I don't think it was us. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and the RV's generator sputtered and died. Buddy started barking wildly, his fur bristling, and the air inside the RV grew icy. "Turn it back on," Adam shouted, panic creeping into his voice. I tried, but the generator wouldn't start. Then we heard the voices. At first, they were faint, like whispers carried on the wind. But they grew louder, overlapping in a strange guttural chant that seemed to echo inside my head. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, determined to find whoever was messing with us. That's when I saw them. Figures, tall and shadowy, standing in the circle. They were barely human, their limbs too long and their heads tilted unnaturally to the side. Their faces were featureless, yet I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. "Mitch," Tasha whispered from behind me. Her voice was trembling. "What are they?" "I don't know," I said, stepping back into the RV and locking the door. "Stay inside." The figures didn't move, but the RV began to creak and groan, as though something was pressing against it. Buddy was barking hysterically, scratching at the walls, and Katie was crying, her bravado gone. "Why are they just standing there?" Adam asked, his voice high-pitched and shaky. "They're waiting," Tasha said quietly. Her face was pale and she clutched her necklace as though it could protect her. "For what? I don't know." The whispers returned, louder this time, and I realized they weren't coming from outside. They were inside the RV, filling every corner with their dark, insidious murmurs. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I opened the door again. Maybe I thought I could reason with them, or maybe I just couldn't stand the sound of those voices anymore. Whatever the case, the moment I stepped into the circle, everything stopped. The whispers, the footsteps, even Buddy's barking. Silence fell over the forest, thick and suffocating. The figures watched me, their heads tilting further as though in curiosity. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaken despite my best efforts to sound strong. One figure stepped forward, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved. Its head split open, revealing burning, hollow eyes that pierced straight through me. "Leave," it said, its voice a deep, guttural growl, but not without payment. I didn't understand at first, but then the others joined me outside, huddling behind me. The figure turned its gaze on Katie, then Adam, and finally Tasha. It seemed to be choosing. "No," I said, stepping in front of them. "Take me." The figure tilted its head again, considering. Then it nodded. I don't remember much after that, just the sensation of being pulled, as though the earth itself was swallowing me. I heard Tasha screaming my name, felt her hands grabbing for me, but it was no use. The last thing I saw was her face, streaked with tears as the circle closed around me. The others made it out, though they never told anyone the full story. The RV was abandoned, left to rot in my parents' yard, and the circle remains as barren as ever. Sometimes on cold nights, Tasha swears she hears my voice calling her name. But I'm not sure it's me. Not anymore. The first thing you notice about Linville Gorge is how the silence feels alive. The wind doesn't rustle through the trees. It whispers like the forest is telling secrets you aren't meant to hear. I chose this place for that very reason. After the divorce, I needed silence. not sympathy. I needed proof that I could survive alone, away from the constant reminders of what I'd lost. It had been 3 weeks since I parked my RV in a small clearing off a winding dirt road. The first week had been easy. I filled my days with hiking, fishing, and reading, classic survivalist stuff. But as the days blurred together, I started to feel the weight of the isolation. At first, it was little things. The sound of my own voice muttering to myself, the way my footsteps echoed louder than they should. Then came the dreams. They started with Jackie, my daughter. "Why didn't you fight for me, Dad?" she asked in that tone she'd perfected at 13, half accusation, half heartbreak. I woke, drenched in sweat, her voice echoing in my head. Jackie had always been my hiking partner. She used to call me Mountain Dad and laugh every time I overpacked our gear. Now, I hadn't spoken to her in months. I couldn't blame her. After the divorce, she stuck with her mother, and I had no fight left to change her mind. On the morning of the 4th week, things started to go wrong. My GPS was the first to fail. I was on a trail I'd hiked dozens of times, but when I checked the screen, the map had vanished, replaced by a blinking cursor that seemed to mock me. I pulled out my compass. It spun wildly, unable to find north. I laughed it off at first. "Classic tech," I muttered, stuffing it into my pocket. But when I retraced my steps, I realized I'd looped back to the same clearing 3 times. The clearing felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows longer. I shook off the unease and returned to the RV, only to find my supplies in disarray. Cans of food were scattered across the floor. My water jug lay on its side, half empty, though I hadn't touched it. I checked the windows and door. Locked. "Damn raccoons," I said aloud, though the words sounded hollow. Milo, my dog, used to bark like mad at the faintest sign of wildlife, but he wasn't here anymore. I had lost him in the divorce, too. That night, I woke to the sound of something or someone moving outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear over the deafening quiet. The sound came again, a faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting my skin. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating trees, rocks, and nothing else. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw them, floating orbs of light, faint and flickering like distant lanterns. "Jackie?" I whispered, though I didn't know why. The orbs hovered for a moment, then darted deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed. The forest seemed to close in around me as I moved, the lights always just out of reach. My feet crunched on leaves and snapped twigs, but the orbs made no sound. They danced through the trees, leading me to the edge of a cliff. That's when I saw her. She stood at the bottom of the gorge, her figure pale and translucent, her head tilted upward as though she was staring right at me. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer to the cliff wall and began to climb. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. When I looked again, she was gone, the lights extinguished. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. Stress and isolation were playing tricks on me, that's all. But the evidence said otherwise. Carved into the side of my RV were 3 words: "Help me." My stomach churned as I traced the letters with my fingers. The edges were rough, as though etched by claws. I packed my things and tried to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered once, twice, then fell silent. I checked the battery. It was drained, though I'd replaced it just 2 weeks ago. Fine, I muttered, grabbing my maps and gear. If the RV wouldn't move, I'd hike out. But when I spread the map on the table, I froze. Every route I marked was gone, replaced by a single winding path leading to the gorge. That night, the pounding began. It started as a faint tapping on the RV walls, like a branch brushing against metal. I ignored it, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me. Then it grew louder, sharp, deliberate, and angry. I bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight. The pounding moved, circling the RV faster and faster. "Who's out there?" I shouted, throwing open the door. The forest was empty. The pounding stopped. But when I turned back inside, my breath caught in my throat. My supplies were scattered again, this time arranged in a pattern I couldn't decipher. A coil of rope lay in the center, knotted like a climbing harness. I didn't sleep after that. Instead, I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. Around 3 a.m., the lights returned. They hovered at the edge of the clearing, brighter than before. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, though my shaking hands betrayed me. The lights blinked once, twice, then began to move. This time, I didn't follow. Instead, I stayed put, watching as they circled the clearing. The air grew colder, the fire flickering as though it might extinguish. Then I heard it. A voice. Lost, alone. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct until I recognized it. "Jackie," I whispered. The voice led me to the gorge. I don't remember deciding to go. I just knew I had to. The pale figure was there again, standing at the edge of the cliff. This time, she didn't climb. She turned to face me, her features clearer in the moonlight. Her face was wrong, distorted, her eyes hollow voids, but her voice was unmistakable. "You're just like me," she said. "Lost, alone." I stumbled back, my chest tightening. "What do you want from me?" "Help me," she said, her voice cracking like an old radio. "Or join me." I don't remember how I got back to the RV, but when I did, I found my gear waiting for me, perfectly packed, as though someone wanted me to leave. The RV engine roared to life on the first try. The lights flickered once in the distance as I drove away, fading into the trees. I made it back home, but the silence followed me. Jackie answered when I called her, her voice cautious but warm. We talked for hours, making plans to meet soon. That night, I found a climbing carabiner on my dresser. It wasn't mine. And I knew, deep down, that I had only left Linville Gorge physically. Something from that place would always be with me. I never wanted to go camping at the Devil's Tramping Ground. "Sarah, it's just a silly story," Jake said, his smile equal parts charming and maddening. "The whole point of this trip is to relax, have some fun, and make memories. Don't tell me you're buying into the ghost stories." I stared at him as he tossed Abby's doll into the RV, not even bothering to buckle it down. It's not just ghost stories. People say weird things happen there. Why risk it? "Because it's different," Jake replied, shrugging. "And Abby's been dying for an adventure. Right, kiddo?" Adventure! Abby cheered from the back seat, clutching her stuffed bunny. She had no idea what the Devil's Tramping Ground was, only that her dad made it sound exciting. I sighed, knowing I was outvoted. We needed this. Jake and I hadn't been connecting lately, and this trip was supposed to be about family time. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe it was just a creepy patch of dirt. The Devil's Tramping Ground was smaller than I expected, a barren, perfect circle of dirt surrounded by dense forest. The ground was stark and lifeless, as though something had drained the very soul from it. Not a blade of grass, not a weed. It's weird, I admitted as we parked the RV just outside the circle. It's cool, Jake said, leaping out of the driver's seat. Abby followed him, her excitement contagious. We've got a prime camping spot. I stepped out reluctantly, the air heavy and damp. The forest around us seemed unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. Our dog, Milo, growled low in his throat, his tail tucked between his legs. What's wrong with him? I asked, but Jake waved me off. Probably just smells a raccoon or something, he said, snapping his fingers at Milo. Come on, boy. Milo refused to enter the circle. He stayed rooted to the spot, whining softly. Abby giggled, skipping right to the center. Look, Mom, I'm standing where the devil walks. Abby, don't joke like that, I snapped, more harshly than I intended. She froze, her wide eyes meeting mine. I softened my tone. Come back here, honey. Let's set up camp. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Jake lit a fire just outside the circle, claiming the dirt was too loose for proper kindling. Abby played with her doll and sang songs to herself, her voice drifting over the crackle of the flames. But as night fell, the unease crept back in. Milo refused to calm down, pacing in circles and growling at the forest. Maybe we should put him inside, I suggested. Sarah, he's fine, Jake replied, though he seemed less confident now. He grabbed a beer from the cooler and settled by the fire. Abby's voice cut through the stillness. Daddy, do you hear that? Hear what, sweetie? She cocked her head, listening. The laughing. Jake and I exchanged a look. Probably just coyotes, he said, but his smile was strained. No, Abby insisted, it's my friend. My stomach dropped. What friend? Abby grinned. Mr. Hollow, he lives here. He said we could stay. I felt the blood drain from my face. Jake, I whispered. Don't start, he muttered, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. She's just playing. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was Milo, but when I sat up, I saw him trembling at the foot of our bed, his ears pinned back. The scratching came again, louder this time, from outside the RV. Jake, I hissed, shaking him awake. What? He groaned. Listen. He froze, hearing it too. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Probably just a raccoon, he said, though his voice wavered. I didn't reply. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The night was pitch black, the fire long since burned out. I swept the beam across the clearing and froze. Abby's doll was standing upright in the middle of the circle. I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me. What is it? Jake asked, his face pale. The doll, I whispered. It's in the circle. That's impossible, he said, though his voice betrayed him. The next day, things got worse. Abby started drawing in the dirt around the RV, strange symbols I didn't recognize. When I asked her about them, she shrugged and said, Mr. Hollow showed me. Jake and I fought constantly. I wanted to leave, but the RV wouldn't start, the engine sputtering uselessly. Our backup battery was drained. "It's just a coincidence," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. That night, the laughter started again, high-pitched, echoing from the woods. Abby sat bolt upright in bed and smiled. "They're coming," she whispered. By the third night, we were unraveling. Jake had dark circles under his eyes, and I was so tense I could barely eat. Abby, meanwhile, seemed oddly calm, humming that same eerie tune over and over. I woke to find her gone. "Jake!" I screamed, shaking him awake. "She's not here!" We bolted outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. Abby was standing in the circle, her back to us. She was humming, her doll clutched in her hand. "Abby!" I cried, running toward her. "Stop!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. "Look!" At the edge of the forest stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and completely black as though it absorbed the light. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, fixed on Abby. "Mr. Hollow," she said softly. Panic took over. "Abby, come here!" I screamed, but she didn't move. Jake grabbed a makeshift torch and ran toward her, waving it at the figure. The light flickered, and the thing recoiled slightly, but it didn't leave. "Get inside!" Jake shouted. I scooped up Abby and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. Jake followed moments later, his face pale. "What was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, clutching Abby tightly. The rest of the night was a nightmare. The scratching returned, louder than before. Objects in the RV moved on their own, Abby's doll crawling across the floor as though alive. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "How?" Jake snapped. "The RV won't start." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay. By dawn, we were desperate. Jake decided to confront the entity, hoping to buy us time. He grabbed the torch and stepped into the circle, shouting, "Leave us alone!" The figure appeared again, its form shifting and growing until it was nearly double its original size. Its clawed hands reached for Jake, the ground beneath him blackening. "Sarah!" he screamed. "Go!" I grabbed Abby and ran, praying the RV would start. As I turned the key, the engine roared to life. I didn't question it. I just hit the gas. Jake dove into the RV seconds before the entity reached him, and we sped away, the figure vanishing into the distance. We didn't speak the entire drive home. Abby fell asleep, clutching her doll, and Jake stared blankly out the window. But as we pulled into our driveway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Etched into the side of the RV, in claw-like marks, were the words, "You can't escape." Epilogue. That night, Abby woke screaming. "It's him!" she cried. "He's here!" And in the corner of her room I swore I saw a shadow that didn't belong. I've always loved the quiet of the wilderness. It's where I feel most at home, with no deadlines, no emails, no pressure to prove I'm anything more than what I am. That's why I packed my camera, my tripod, and a week's worth of supplies and drove my RV into the heart of the Appalachian forest near Graveyard Fields. I'd read about the area before, a hiker's paradise, with cascading waterfalls and misty trails that could swallow a man whole. It was the perfect backdrop for the wildlife photography portfolio I'd been working on. But I hadn't counted on the eerie silence that blanketed the place, a silence so thick it seemed alive. That first evening, I met Heather and Tom, a friendly couple parked in their RV at the next campsite over. Heather had a knack for conversation, and Tom was quiet but pleasant enough. They invited me to join their campfire after I set up my site, and I accepted, figuring a little company wouldn't hurt. Heather was the one who brought up the stories. "You know the legend of Graveyard Fields?" she asked, poking at the fire. "I've heard it got its name because the tree stumps look like graves," I replied. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "That's the tame version. The locals talk about other things." "Like what?" I asked, leaning forward. I wasn't one for ghost stories, but there was something compelling about her tone. Tom shifted uncomfortably, but Heather pressed on. "They say this place is cursed, that it used to be a burial ground long before settlers came. People who camp here sometimes see a child, just a boy, wandering alone, but he's not real, he's a shadow." I smirked. "A shadow boy?" Tom frowned at me. "Laugh all you want. We saw something last night. It wasn't natural." I wanted to ask more, but the conversation fizzled after that. When I returned to my RV, the forest seemed darker, the quiet heavier. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to their stories. The next morning, I decided to hike a lesser-used trail, hoping to capture some candid shots of wildlife. As I walked, the trees grew denser, their twisted branches blocking out the sun. The air felt colder, and my footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should have. I kept going, telling myself it was all in my head. About an hour in, I heard it, a faint sobbing. I froze, straining my ears. It was unmistakable. A child crying. The sound came from deeper in the woods, off the trail. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The sobbing stopped. My heart pounded as I stepped off the path, pushing through the underbrush toward the sound. That's when I saw him, a small boy in a dark, hooded jacket, sitting on a mossy stump with his back to me. Relief flooded through me. "Hey, kid, are you okay? Are you lost?" He didn't respond. I moved closer, and that's when he turned. His face was pale, almost translucent, his eyes like two black pits. He whispered, "Help me find my way." Before I could react, he stood and darted into the trees. Instinct kicked in. I grabbed my camera and followed, snapping photos as I ran. The boy moved faster than any child should, his movements unnatural, like a puppet pulled on strings. "Wait!" I shouted, but he disappeared, leaving me alone in a clearing. The air was colder here, and the ground was covered in strange symbols carved into the dirt. At the center was an ancient, jagged stone, half buried and covered in moss. My camera's battery suddenly drained, the screen flickering before going dark. I returned to camp shaken, but trying to rationalize what I'd seen. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, or maybe some local playing a prank. But when I arrived, Heather and Tom were gone. Their RV was still there, its door hanging open. Their chairs and cooking supplies were scattered as if they'd left in a hurry. I called out for them, but the only response was the rustle of leaves in the wind. That night, the forest came alive with sounds I couldn't explain. Whispers carried on the breeze, footsteps circling my RV, and once a faint knock on the door. I didn't open it. The next morning, I set out to find Heather and Tom. I retraced the trail back to the clearing, my camera in hand. When I reached the spot, the boy was waiting for me, standing beside the stone. "Who are you?" I demanded. My voice cracked, but I held my ground. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Do you hear them?" I didn't understand. "Hear who?" "The forgotten," he said. "They want you to stay." The shadows around him began to shift, rising like smoke. That's when I saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their forms blurred and flickering like old film reels. Heather and Tom were among them, their faces blank, their eyes empty. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering. "What do you want?" The boy's voice deepened, no longer a child's. "You trespassed. You belong to him now." A low, guttural growl filled the air and the ground trembled beneath my feet. The keeper emerged from the darkness, a towering figure cloaked in mist, its face a void. Its voice echoed in my skull, accusing me of disturbing the burial ground. "You will join them," it said, its outstretched hand pulling the air around me into a crushing vortex. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the forest warped around me. No matter which direction I turned, I ended up back at the clearing. The keeper was relentless, its shadow stretching toward me with every step. Then I remembered something Heather had said by the fire. A symbol, a rune said to protect against spirits. Desperate, I searched the ground for anything I could use. My knife trembled in my hands as I carved the rune into a nearby tree. The keeper paused, its shadow recoiling as the symbol began to glow. The boy screamed, his form dissolving into smoke. The shadowy figures vanished one by one, their anguished cries echoing through the trees. The keeper let out an inhuman wail before retreating into the mist. When I woke, I was lying outside my RV, my clothes damp with dew. My camera was gone and the clearing was nowhere to be found. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. Weeks later, I developed the few photos I had left. One image stood out, a blurry shot of the clearing, the boy standing beside the stone. In the background, barely visible, was the shadow of the keeper, watching. Now, every time I close my eyes, I hear whispers. They're waiting for me to return. I thought a weekend alone in the woods would be a fresh start. After the divorce, I needed time to clear my head, to prove to myself that I could handle life alone. That's how I ended up in Croatan National Forest, parked beside Hollow Creek in my battered RV. The creek was beautiful, calm, narrow, with overhanging cypress trees reflected in the still water. I thought the isolation would be peaceful. I was wrong. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a short trail, journaled my thoughts, and cooked a quick dinner over the campfire. It felt good, in a way, to escape the suffocating sympathy of friends and the condescension of my ex-husband. For once, I was just me. The sunset over the creek was stunning, its fiery hues mirrored perfectly in the water. I was sitting by the fire, sipping wine, when a forest ranger arrived. He was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and a tired smile. The name stitched on his uniform read Holt. "Evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "You here alone?" I nodded, trying not to bristle at the question. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all," he said, though his tone made me feel otherwise. "Just wanted to let you know the creek's currents can be dangerous. People have accidents out here, especially at night." "Thanks for the warning," I said, brushing him off. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on the creek. "And if you hear anything strange," he added, "don't investigate, especially if it sounds like a child. Just stay in your RV." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me. Why would there be a child out here? "You'd be surprised," he said grimly. Then he tipped his hat again and walked back to his truck, leaving me alone with the fading fire and an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. The first night passed without incident, though I slept fitfully. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of shadows twisting in the water, reaching for me with clawed fingers. The next day, I woke to overcast skies and a creeping sense of dread I couldn't explain. Shaking it off, I decided to take my kayak down the creek. The water was still, almost unnaturally so, and I paddled in silence, the only sound the rhythmic splash of the oar. About a mile down, I spotted something strange. A doll. It was propped against a tree on the bank, its face pale and cracked, its dress tattered. I paddled closer, uneasy but curious. Who leaves a doll in the middle of the forest? I didn't notice the girl until she spoke. "Isn't she pretty?" I jumped, nearly tipping the kayak. The girl stood on the bank, barefoot and wearing a white dress that was too thin for the chilly air. Her hair was dark and matted, her face smudged with dirt. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "Where did you come from?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I got lost. Can you help me find my family?" My first thought was to get her back to the campsite and call the ranger, but something about her felt off. Her voice was flat, almost mechanical, and her eyes seemed too old for her face. Still, I couldn't leave a child alone in the woods. "Come with me," I said. "We'll figure this out." She climbed into the kayak without hesitation, her small hands clutching the edges as I paddled back upstream. She didn't say a word the entire way, and when I glanced at her reflection in the water, I swear it didn't match her movements. Back at the campsite, I wrapped her in a blanket and made her hot chocolate. She sat at the table in the RV, sipping silently, her dark eyes following me everywhere. I tried asking her questions, her name, where she was from, but all she would say was, "Lyla." "Lyla, do you know how you got here?" I pressed. She looked down at the mug, her fingers tracing the rim. "The creek brings people here. It's lonely." I didn't know what to say to that. Before I could ask more, there was a knock at the door. It was Ranger Holt, looking more uneasy than ever. "You found her," he said, his voice low. "I was going to call you," I began, but he cut me off. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "Pack up and go now." "What? Why?" He glanced past me to Lyla, who was staring at him with an unnerving intensity. "She's not what she seems." I opened my mouth to argue, but a cold, wet hand gripped mine. I looked down. Lyla was standing beside me, her head tilted at that unnatural angle again. "Don't listen to him," she said softly. "He doesn't want you to stay." "Damn right I don't," Holt muttered. "Ma'am, please. She's not a child. She's something else. Something tied to the creek." Lila's grip tightened, and for a moment her eyes looked empty, like twin voids. "He's lying," she hissed. I yanked my hand away, suddenly terrified. I need a minute." Holt gave me one last pleading look before retreating to his truck. Lyla sat back down, her expression calm, but the air in the RV felt suffocating, as if it were holding its breath. That night, the scratching began. It started as a faint sound, like tree branches scraping the side of the RV. Then it grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across the metal. I peered out the window, but all I saw was darkness. "Is it him?" Lyla asked, her voice small and innocent. "No," I said, though I wasn't sure. I locked the doors and sat at the table, my hands trembling. Lyla watched me with a faint smile. "You should come with me," she said suddenly. "Come where?" "To the creek," she said, her tone sweet but firm. "It's better there. It's peaceful." "No," I said, shaking my head. "We're staying here." Her smile faltered. For a moment, her face seemed to ripple, as if it weren't entirely solid. "You promised," she said, her voice deepening. Then she vanished, leaving the blanket crumpled on the floor. I barely slept, and when dawn broke, I decided to investigate the creek. If I could find some logical explanation, something to prove Holt wrong, I could move on. Armed with a flashlight and a knife, I followed the path to the water. The creek was quiet, its surface unnaturally still. I scanned the banks, looking for clues, but the only thing I found was the doll, now lying face down in the mud. I picked it up, and the air grew colder. "Do you like her?" Lila's voice came from behind me. I turned, and there she was, standing ankle-deep in the water, her dress dripping. "Lyla," I said, trying to sound calm, "come back to the RV." She smiled, but her eyes were black pits. "You're already here," she said, and the shadows around her began to move. They rose from the water like tendrils, twisting and writhing, reaching for me. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, as Lila's form began to dissolve into the dark. "Run!" a voice shouted. I turned to see Holt holding an old iron lantern that glowed faintly. The shadows recoiled from its light, and he grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the water. Back at the campsite, Holt explained everything. The creek was cursed, tied to an ancient spirit that fed on loneliness and guilt. Lyla wasn't a child. She was bait, a puppet used to lure victims to their doom. "You're lucky you didn't make the pact," Holt said, his face pale. "Most don't get a second chance." I didn't ask what the pact entailed. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I needed to leave. As I drove away from Hollow Creek, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But as I reached the edge of the park, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A single word was scrawled in the fogged glass, written as if by a child's finger. Promise. My name is Sarah, and I've always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, UFO sightings, haunted houses, it's all fodder for gullible minds, not for someone like me. As a freelance journalist, I've built my career on exposing the truth behind local legends. So when my brother Evan called, excited about investigating the Brown Mountain Lights, I thought it was perfect. An easy piece to debunk another so-called supernatural phenomenon. Evan, of course, believed every word of the folklore surrounding the lights. He was a self-proclaimed paranormal investigator, and every family holiday was a chance for him to pitch me some new absurd theory. This time he'd roped in his best friend, Jordan, a tech enthusiast who fancied himself the group's problem solver. The three of us loaded up Evan's aging RV and drove to Wiseman's View, a remote overlook in North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest, where the infamous lights were most commonly seen. I was ready to prove them wrong. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that night. The drive up to Wiseman's View was steep and narrow, the forest pressing in on all sides. Our RV rattled with every pothole, and I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence outside. The trees seemed to whisper as the wind passed through their skeletal branches, and somewhere in the distance coyotes howled, a low, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "This is it," Evan announced, pulling into a clearing just shy of the overlook. "Prime spot for activity." Jordan hopped out first, unloading camera equipment and motion sensors with almost childlike enthusiasm. "Think we'll see the lights tonight?" he asked. "Of course we will," Evan said, grinning. "They've been documented for centuries. The Cherokee talked about them. Early settlers claimed they were ghostly lanterns from a battle long ago." I rolled my eyes. "Or they're just swamp gas or refracted light from the valley." "Swamp gas," Evan muttered, shaking his head. "You always have an answer, don't you?" "Because there's always a logical explanation." Evan didn't reply. Instead, he set up his tripod near the RV while Jordan fiddled with a thermal drone. I grabbed my notebook and recorder, intending to document every step of the process. If I was going to write this story, I wanted to cover all angles. The first night was uneventful. The lights didn't show, but the forest seemed alive in other ways. Coyotes howled closer than before, their calls almost distorted, as if something was mimicking them. And once, as I stepped away from the fire to grab my recorder, I thought I heard my name whispered from the darkness. "Sarah?" I froze, turning toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees and shadows, probably Evan playing a prank. But when I asked him about it later, he swore he hadn't heard a thing. The second night was when things started to change. We hiked to the overlook at sunset, setting up our equipment to capture the perfect view of the valley below. The horizon turned a deep red as the sun dipped behind the mountains, and that's when we saw them. Faint, glowing orbs floating just above the ridgeline. At first, they seemed random, flickering like fireflies, but soon they began to move in unison, almost as if they were circling us. "There they are," Evan whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "Swamp gas," I muttered, though my heart pounded in my chest. I raised my camera, zooming in on the lights, but no matter how close I got, their edges remained blurry, like they were made of smoke. "Do swamp gases follow a pattern?" Jordan asked, his tone unusually serious. I didn't answer. Something about the lights felt wrong. They moved with intent, almost as if they were alive, and then they disappeared, leaving us in darkness. "Did you hear that?" Evan said suddenly. I strained my ears. A low, guttural growl came from somewhere in the woods behind us. My pulse quickened. Probably a coyote. "That didn't sound like a coyote," Jordan said, his hand hovering over the flashlight at his side. We packed up quickly, the sense of unease growing with every passing moment. Back at the RV, I noticed claw marks on one of the tires. Deep, jagged lines that couldn't have come from an animal. Evan said it was nothing, but I caught the nervous glance he shared with Jordan. The third night was our last. It had to be. We decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to find the source of the lights. Evan was determined to prove they were supernatural, while I was determined to prove the opposite. Jordan, always the peacemaker, followed silently, his drone buzzing overhead. The forest grew denser as we walked, the trees gnarled and ancient, their roots curling like the fingers of buried giants. The air felt heavier here, charged with something I couldn't quite explain. And then we found it. A fire pit, long abandoned, with ashes that looked fresh despite the lack of recent visitors. Around it were carvings in the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, jagged and cruel. Jordan scanned them with his phone. "They look like some kind of Appalachian witchcraft," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evan knelt by the fire pit, brushing away debris to reveal a rusted iron cross buried beneath the ashes. "This must be tied to the lights," he said. "Maybe a ward against them." I was about to dismiss him when we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the clearing. The lights appeared again, hovering between the trees, casting long, flickering shadows. And then she emerged. She was smoke and shadow, a towering figure with hollow eyes that burned like embers. Her face flickered between forms, a child's innocent gaze, an old woman's sneer, and something inhuman, all sharp angles and jagged teeth. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The witch. She was real. Jordan was the first to break the spell. He grabbed Evan and me, pulling us toward the trail. "Run!" We bolted through the woods, the witch's laughter echoing behind us. The lights followed, darting between trees like malevolent fireflies, their glow growing brighter, harsher. I tripped, falling hard against a root, and Evan stopped to help me. But Jordan kept running. We found him later, his body crumpled near the RV. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, but his face was drained of all color, his skin as pale as ash. I knelt beside him, shaking him, screaming his name, but it was no use. He was gone. The drone footage revealed his final moments. The witch had cornered him near the clearing, her form stretching unnaturally as she reached for him. His last words, spoken in a trembling whisper, were burned into my mind. "You are mine now." Evan and I knew we couldn't leave things as they were. We returned to the fire pit, armed with the iron cross and what little courage we had left. The witch was waiting, her form more solid now, her eyes burning brighter. She lunged at us, her shadowy limbs stretching impossibly far, but Evan held her back with the cross, its iron glowing red-hot in her presence. "Do it!" he shouted. I grabbed the cross and drove it into the ground, burying it deep in the ashes. The witch let out a piercing scream, her form dissolving into smoke. The lights flickered and faded, leaving the forest eerily silent. We left Brown Mountain that night, Jordan's lifeless body lying in the back of the RV. I never wrote the article. Some truths are too dangerous to share. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see her, the witch, waiting in the darkness, her burning eyes promising she isn't done with me yet. The ridge loomed above me, jagged and foreboding, as I parked the RV at the end of the narrow dirt road. It was late afternoon, and the last golden rays of sunlight barely pierced the canopy of the Linville Gorge. I glanced at my GPS, frowning when I saw the blank no signal message glaring back at me. The locals called this place Devil's Ridge, and the stories I'd read about it were enough to make anyone think twice. But this was exactly why I was here. As a photographer, I'd spent years chasing forgotten places and eerie stories. My blog, Shadowed Earth, had become a small but dedicated space for others like me, people who craved the thrill of the unknown. This time, it wasn't just another dilapidated building or an overgrown cemetery. This was a cursed forest, or so the legend claimed. I slung my camera bag over my shoulder and stepped out of the RV, inhaling the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The air was thick and oddly still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I found a clearing a short hike from the road and set up camp. It was a perfect spot, close enough to the trail but tucked away from prying eyes. The ridge itself stretched high above me, its rocky face crumbling in places streaked with moss and lichen. As I unpacked, a man emerged from the forest, startling me. He was tall, with graying hair and a worn ranger's jacket. His expression was kind but cautious. "You must be Harper," he said. I froze. "How do you know my name?" "You mentioned you were coming when you called the visitors center last week." He smiled faintly and extended a hand. "I'm Elliot Crane, local historian." I shook his hand hesitantly, studying him. "Did you come all the way out here just to welcome me?" "Not exactly," he said, his gaze drifting toward the ridge. "This place has history. People get drawn to it, but they don't always come back." "That's why I'm here," I said, trying to sound confident. Elliot shook his head. "You don't understand. The stories, they're not just stories. Devil's Ridge has a way of keeping people. You should leave before nightfall." I bristled at his tone. "I'm here to document this place. I'm not leaving." Elliot studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "If you won't leave, take this." He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and handed it to me. It smelled faintly of herbs. "What is it?" "A charm," he said, "to keep the witch at bay." The first night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows cast by my fire seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and flickering against the trees. The next morning, I woke with a dull ache in my wrist. When I rolled up my sleeve, I saw it. A faint bruise in the shape of a hand, the fingers long and thin. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my fingers over the mark. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as some random injury, but it nagged at me as I packed my camera and set off toward the ridge. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as I climbed. The trees closed in around me, their gnarled branches weaving a canopy so dense that the sunlight barely broke through. The air grew colder, sharper with every step. When I reached the old mine entrance, I froze. The ruins were more intact than I'd expected. Stone walls crumbling but still standing, the shaft itself a yawning black void. My pulse quickened. This was the heart of the legend. As I raised my camera to take a photo, a faint whisper brushed my ear. "Harper." I spun around, my heart pounding. The forest was empty. I returned to camp unsettled, but the feeling of unease quickly turned to frustration when I reviewed my photos. Most were perfectly normal, but a few showed strange distortions, faint faces in the trees, blurred shapes where nothing had been. It had to be a technical glitch, I told myself, but when I looked at the handprint on my wrist, now darker and more defined, I wasn't so sure. That evening, Elliot appeared again. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Because I have a job to do," I snapped. "What's your deal anyway? You keep warning me, but you won't explain why." Elliot hesitated, then sighed. "The witch. She was accused of poisoning a magistrate's son in the 1700s. They hanged her from an oak tree near the ridge. But before she died, she cursed the land. Said anyone who trespassed would bear her mark." I stiffened. "The mark?" Elliot's eyes flicked to my wrist. His expression darkened. "You've been marked." I stepped back. "How do you know that?" "Because I've seen it before," he said quietly. "You need to leave, now." That night, the whispers came again. They circled my camp, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. I tried to drown them out by stoking the fire, but the shadows seemed to dance closer. Harper. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was my mother's voice. I froze, my chest tightening. My mother had been dead for years. "Help me, Harper." I grabbed the charm Elliot had given me, clutching it tightly. The whispers receded, but the forest felt alive, pulsing with unseen energy. The climax came the next day. Determined to confront whatever was haunting me, I returned to the mine. The air round it was colder than before, and the shadows seemed to ripple, moving even when the trees stood still. As I stepped inside, the world shifted. I wasn't in the mine anymore. I was in a clearing, surrounded by jeering townsfolk. At the center stood a woman, her face pale and defiant, a noose around her neck. "Mark them!" she screamed as the mob pushed her onto the gallows. "Mark them all!" The vision shattered, and I was back in the mine. But I wasn't alone. The witch stood before me, her hollow eyes burning with fury. Her skeletal hand reached for me, the same hand that had marked my wrist. I stumbled back, raising my camera like it was a weapon. The flash fired, illuminating her face. She recoiled, hissing, and I ran. I don't remember much about the descent from the ridge. When I reached my RV, Elliot was gone, and so was the charm he'd given me. I drove away without looking back, but the mark on my wrist never faded. The photos I captured from that trip remain the most haunting I've ever taken. Distorted face, shadowy figures, and one shot of the witch herself, standing at the mine's edge, her hand outstretched. I posted them to my blog, but I've never told anyone the full story. Some things are better left in the shadows. I didn't know how much he hated me until we were halfway up the ridge. Sam sat in the passenger seat of the RV, arms crossed and jaw clenched, glaring at the windshield like it had personally offended him. The winding dirt road was a nightmare, the RV lurching and groaning as it crawled over rocks and deep ruts. "Mom, this is stupid," Sam muttered, his voice low but sharp. I gripped the wheel tighter. "We talked about this, Sam. We need some time away from everything. Your school, my work, just us." "Yeah, because ditching Wi-Fi and driving into the middle of nowhere is really gonna fix everything." I didn't answer. Sam had been like this ever since his dad left. Angry, sarcastic, distant. I thought this trip could be a fresh start for us, but already it felt like I was failing. We reached the campsite by mid-afternoon, a small clearing at the base of Black Hollow Ridge. The ridge itself loomed above us, its rocky face covered in gnarled trees and creeping moss. It was eerily beautiful, but the air felt heavy, like the forest was watching. "Cool spot," Sam said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he kicked at the dirt. I busied myself setting up the fire pit while Sam wandered to the edge of the clearing. He pulled out his phone, holding it up like it might magically find a signal. It didn't. "Great, no bars. Guess I'm stuck here with you." "Sam," I started, but the arrival of a ranger cut me off. "Afternoon," the man said, tipping his hat. His name tag read Officer Morales. He had a friendly face but carried himself like someone who'd seen too much. "Afternoon," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "Just getting settled in." Morales glanced at Sam, then at the ridge. "You're not planning to go too far up there, are you?" I frowned. "We were going to hike some of the trails tomorrow." "Stay low," he said quickly, his tone darkening. "People get lost up there, even experienced hikers. The ridge has a reputation." "Reputation?" Sam perked up, his sarcasm replaced by curiosity. Morales hesitated. Old stories, miners who died in the shafts back in the 1800s. Some say their spirits never left. I've heard of shadows, whispers, people vanishing. I forced a laugh, trying to ease the tension. I think we'll be fine. Morales gave me a long, measured look. Just be careful, and don't go near the mine ruins. That night, as we sat by the fire, Sam was unusually quiet. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows across the trees. "Do you believe that ranger?" Sam finally asked. "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "He's just trying to scare us." Sam poked at the fire with a stick. "Dad would have thought it was cool." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. The forest around us was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain. No wind, no crickets, just stillness. And then, faintly, a sound. A whisper. I froze, my hand tightening around the mug of coffee I'd been holding. "Did you hear that?" Sam looked up, frowning. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. "Never mind, it's nothing." The next morning, we set out on the trail. Sam sulked behind me, his boots crunching against the dirt. The ridge loomed larger as we climbed, its jagged face casting long shadows over the forest. We reached the old mine ruins by noon. The air colder here, the trees gnarled and twisted. A crumbling stone arch marked the entrance, and deep within, the shaft yawned like an open mouth. "Whoa," Sam said, stepping closer. "Don't," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "Relax, Mom. It's just a hole." But it wasn't just a hole. The darkness inside seemed to shift like it was alive, watching us. "Let's keep moving," I said, pulling him away. The first real sign of danger came that afternoon. Sam and I had argued, again, and he'd stormed off, claiming he needed space. I let him go, figuring he'd cool off and come back. But an hour passed, then 2. "Sam," I called, my voice echoing through the forest. No answer. Panic bubbled in my chest. I retraced my steps, calling his name, but the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees all looked the same, and the trail disappeared beneath my feet. And then I heard it. "Mom!" My heart leapt. I turned toward the sound, running blindly through the trees. "Sam, where are you?" "Over here." His voice was close now, just beyond a thicket of bushes. I pushed through, and nothing. No Sam. No trail. Just the mine entrance, impossibly close even though I'd been walking in the opposite direction. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and a whisper tickled my ear. "Leave." When I found Sam, he was sitting on a rock, staring at his hands. "Sam," I cried, rushing to him. "Where were you? I've been looking for you for hours." He looked up, his face pale. I don't know. I thought I was following you." "What do you mean?" "I heard your voice," he said, his voice trembling. "You were calling me. But then I realized it wasn't you." That night, the whispers returned. They circled the RV, soft and insistent, growing louder the longer we ignored them. Sam pressed his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth on the bed. "Make it stop," he whispered. I peeked out the window. Shadows moved between the trees, too fast and too fluid to be human. I grabbed the lantern I'd found in the mine ruins earlier, a relic left behind, its glass cracked but still intact. I didn't know why I'd kept it, but something about it felt important. "Stay here," I told Sam, lighting the lantern. "Mom, don't. I'll be right back." The forest was alive with movement. Shadows flitted through the trees, and the whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once. My hands shook, but I held the lantern high, its flickering light cutting through the darkness. "Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice echoing. The whispers stopped, and then it appeared. A towering figure stepped out from the shadows, its body shrouded in darkness. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, a blank canvas. It tilted its head as if curious and raised a hand, beckoning me closer. "No," I said, clutching the lantern tighter. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like static. The light hurt it. "Leave us alone," I shouted, stepping forward. The lantern's glow brightened, and the figure let out a low, guttural hiss before vanishing into the shadows. At dawn, Sam and I left everything behind. We didn't speak as we stumbled down the ridge, our footsteps heavy, our breaths ragged. Officer Morales found us near the trailhead, his face pale when he saw our condition. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Not everyone makes it back." As we drove away, Sam broke the silence. "Mom?" "Yeah?" "I'm sorry for everything." Tears stung my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. "Me too." We didn't look back. But as we reached the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the top of the ridge, watching us leave. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, and even now I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. I didn't want to go. Let's start there. Tyler, my younger brother, has a knack for dragging me into the kind of adventures you only regret later. Half-baked, poorly planned, and doomed from the start. But he was excited, and I hadn't spent much time with him lately. He spun this trip to Nantahala National Forest as a bonding experience, with a sprinkle of urban legend to spice things up. "Come on, Rachel," he'd said over the phone, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Whiteside Mountain is full of history. There are Cherokee stories about spirits, protectors of the land. I read about shadow people and voices in the woods. You love creepy stuff, right?" What I love is watching creepy movies in the safety of my apartment, not trudging through the woods looking for it. But Tyler has a way of getting under my skin. So here I was, cramped in a weathered RV with my best friend Lisa, Tyler, and his quiet friend Milo, heading into one of the most remote parts of the forest. We set up camp at dusk, a small clearing tucked into the shadow of Whiteside Mountain. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine. Tyler was in his element, unloading gear and cracking jokes while Milo fiddled with his camera, pointing it at the treetops like he was hoping Bigfoot would stroll by. "This place has vibes," Lisa muttered, eyeing the woods. "What kind of vibes?" I asked. "The don't be here after dark kind," she said, folding her arms. "Perfect," Tyler grinned. "That's exactly why we're here." The first signs of trouble started with the tent. Tyler hadn't checked the gear before we left, and as we tried to set it up, we discovered 2 broken poles. Rain clouds loomed overhead, and Lisa didn't hesitate to voice her annoyance. "Of course. Tyler strikes again," she snapped, glaring at him. "Relax," he said, laughing it off. "We'll fix it. It's an adventure." We jerry-rigged the tent as best we could, but when the rain started, the flimsy tarp gave out, soaking everything inside. I retreated to the RV, which wasn't much better. The tiny space felt claustrophobic and tensions were rising. "You knew it was gonna rain, right?" Lisa said, staring daggers at Tyler. "It's fine," Tyler said. "We're fine." The rain eased after midnight, leaving the forest eerily silent. I was outside with Lisa, trying to dry our damp sleeping bags near the fire, when she froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. Nothing. Not even the usual hum of insects. "What?" I asked. "Whispers," she said, her voice barely audible. A chill ran down my spine. "It's just the wind," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Lisa stared into the darkness. "No, someone's out there." Milo was the first to capture something strange. The next morning, he reviewed footage he'd taken the night before. "There," he said, pointing to the screen. We huddled around his camera. The video showed the edge of our campsite, where faint shadows flickered between the trees. No one was moving in that direction, and yet... "It's probably just light from the fire," Tyler said, brushing it off. Milo shook his head. "It's not the fire. Look." He rewound the footage. The shadows moved independently, too fast and too fluid to be normal. Lisa groaned. "Great. Shadow people. I knew it." "You didn't know anything," Tyler said. "Both of you stop," I snapped. "We're here. Let's just stick together, okay?" That evening, the forest's unease deepened. The sounds of life, the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of birds vanished again. We sat around the fire in a heavy silence, each of us acutely aware of how wrong everything felt. Lisa broke the tension. "Did anyone else dream weird last night?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Lisa hesitated. "I saw a figure, no face, just standing by the fire. I thought I was awake, but..." "I had the same dream," Milo said quietly. A shiver ran down my spine. "Me too." Tyler scoffed. "Guys, come on, it's just the power of suggestion." Lisa glared at him, then explained why I woke up with scratches on my arm. She held out her wrist. 3 thin, red lines ran down her skin. The tipping point came the next day. Tyler went off alone to gather firewood while the rest of us stayed behind. He was gone longer than he should have been, and when he finally returned, his face was pale. "Where were you?" I demanded. He hesitated, looking at the ground. "I don't know. I thought I heard your voice calling me, Rachel, but when I followed it, I got turned around." "What do you mean, my voice?" He looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "I swear it was you, but it wasn't." That night, everything escalated. We decided to pack up and leave at first light, but as darkness fell, the forest came alive with whispers and distant laughter. Milo tried to film it, but his camera refused to work. "Stop messing with it," Lisa hissed, her voice trembling. "I'm not," Milo said. "It's just static." We huddled inside the RV, but it didn't feel safe. The walls seemed too thin, the windows too exposed. Then came the knocking. Soft, deliberate. Lisa screamed and Tyler bolted to the window. "There's no one out there," he yelled. "Get away from the window," I shouted. The knocking moved, first to the door, then the back of the RV. It was circling us. Milo pointed at the camera. "It's recording." The screen showed nothing but static at first, but then, faintly, a figure emerged. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long, its face smooth and featureless. It stood just outside the RV, watching. "Turn it off," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. By dawn, the forest was deathly quiet again. we left everything behind. Gear, the fire pit, even the RV. We just walked, desperate to find the trailhead. The thing didn't chase us, but we felt its presence lingering in the shadows. When we finally stumbled onto the main road, I looked back once. Just once. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. We don't talk about that trip anymore. Lisa refuses to go camping. Tyler pretends it didn't happen. Milo uploaded the corrupted footage to his YouTube channel. It went viral, of course. In the final frame, you can see it. Its glowing eyes watching us from the trees. I don't camp anymore. People called me reckless for traveling alone, but solitude had always been my sanctuary. That's why I parked my RV at the Devil's Tramping Ground, a barren circle in the woods of Chatham County. The legends surrounding it, of the devil himself pacing the clearing, leaving it lifeless, intrigued me. Local superstition didn't scare me. I'd seen too many haunted places turn out to be nothing more than exaggerated campfire tales. But something about this place was different from the moment I arrived. The circle looked just as described. It was barren and strange, the edges so precise it seemed unnatural. Trees grew tall and thick around it, their branches like twisted arms reaching toward the sky. I parked just outside the clearing and set up my gear, a camera, tripod, and some recording equipment. My plan was to capture the night sky above the circle, hopefully getting some dramatic shots of stars and maybe the eerie glow some locals claimed to see. As I set up my camera, a voice startled me. "You shouldn't stay here after dark." I turned to see a man standing at the edge of the woods, his silhouette framed by the sinking sun. He looked about 40, with a weathered face and a wide-brimmed hat that screamed local. "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. "Just taking some pictures." The man stepped closer. "Name's Eli. I live nearby," he said. "I've seen things out here that'd make you pack up and leave right now if you had any sense." "Things like what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't want to entertain his superstition, but I couldn't deny the hint of unease his words stirred in me. "Voices in the dark. Lights that don't belong. People who go missing," he said, his voice low. "My brother stayed here once. Never came home." I hesitated, torn between dismissing his warning and asking for more details. Finally, I settled on a dismissive smile. "Thanks for the concern, but I'm not planning on wandering too far from the RV." Eli shook his head. "Mark my words, the devil walks that circle." With that, he disappeared into the woods, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing shadows. As night fell, the clearing took on an eerie quality. The surrounding woods seemed darker than they should have been, the tree line a solid wall of black. My camera malfunctioned twice, the images coming out blurred or overexposed despite my adjustments. I blamed the cold and my equipment, though deep down I wasn't so sure. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a low, guttural growl that echoed from somewhere in the trees. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bobcat or a coyote. Nothing unusual for these woods. But then the growling stopped, replaced by whispers. They were faint at first, like voices carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to circle the clearing, growing louder and more distinct. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness, flashlight in hand. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw them, hoof-like prints in the dirt, circling the RV and leading directly into the tramping ground. My breath caught. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and the prints were fresh, pressed deep into the soil as though left by something heavy. The camera captured nothing but static when I tried to record. Frustrated and increasingly unnerved, I decided to retreat into the RV for the night. Whatever was out there, I told myself, could wait until morning. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the RV. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was faint, almost rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint outline of a hand, or something like a hand, pressed against the glass. Gathering my courage, I yanked the curtain aside. The window was empty. Nothing but the clearing beyond, bathed in pale moonlight. I sat back, trying to calm my breathing, when I noticed something new. The barren circle looked different. It seemed to shimmer, the edges blurring as though it were alive. And in the center stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly far. Its form was shrouded in darkness, but two glowing red eyes pierced through, fixed directly on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure didn't approach. It just stood there, its eyes unblinking. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed. The RV. I scrambled to lock the door, though some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing was, it didn't need to knock. It could enter whenever it wanted. Dawn brought no comfort. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and heavy. I found more hoof prints around the RV, along with something new, long, claw-like scratches on the side of the vehicle. My hands trembled as I packed up my gear, desperate to leave. Just as I was about to start the engine, Eli appeared again, his expression grim. "I told you to leave," he said. "You think I don't want to?" I snapped. "This thing out here, what is it?" Eli hesitated, then sighed. "Some say it's the devil himself. Others say it's older than that, tied to the land long before we got here. Whatever it is, it feeds on fear, lures you in, doesn't let go." "Great," I muttered. "So, what do I do?" Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. "Salt," he said. "Circle the clearing if you have to. Keep it out." I didn't ask questions. At this point, I was willing to try anything. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They called my name, mimicking voices I recognized. My mother, my best friend, even Eli. Each time I reminded myself of his warning. The voices weren't real, but the figure came back. It stood closer this time, just beyond the salt I'd scattered. Its eyes burned brighter, its form flickering like a flame. The air grew heavy, and I struggled to breathe. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in a voice that echoed directly in my mind. "Come." I felt myself drawn toward the circle, my body moving against my will. The salt held it back, but only barely. My legs trembled as I fought to resist, the force pulling me closer and closer. "Leave her alone," Eli's voice rang out, breaking the spell. He rushed into the clearing, scattering more salt around me. The figure recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting screech before vanishing into the shadows. By morning, I was gone, the RV bouncing along the dirt road as I sped away from the tramping ground. Eli refused to come with me, insisting he had unfinished business in the woods. Before I left, he handed me a small talisman, a crude carving of a horned figure. "Keep this close," he said. "It might not stop it, but it'll give you a chance." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. But even now, miles away from the devil's tramping ground, I feel its presence. The talisman grows warmer every night, and in my dreams I see those red eyes watching me, waiting. Whatever haunts that circle isn't done with me yet. I didn't come to Brown Mountain to chase ghosts. I came for science. The Brown Mountain lights, those infamous floating orbs that have baffled locals and tourists for centuries, were supposed to have a geological explanation. That's what I believed when I packed my equipment into Mia's aging RV and let her and Trevor tag along. They'd been hounding me for a fun adventure, and since I didn't want to hike into the wilderness alone, I figured their company was a necessary evil. I didn't know then how badly it would end. We parked the RV at a small, primitive campsite just a mile from the Brown Mountain overlook. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves, the way forests always do at dusk. Mia buzzed with excitement, her camera swinging from her neck as she narrated to no one in particular. "We're here at the legendary Brown Mountain, North Carolina," she said, her voice taking on the exaggerated drama she used for her YouTube channel. "Home of the mysterious lights that scientists, ghost hunters, and alien enthusiasts can't explain." "Don't forget people with common sense," I muttered, unloading my gear. "Jess, come on," Mia whined. "Can you just pretend to have fun for once? This place is creepy and cool. Your vibe if you'd loosen up." I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on unpacking my tools, seismograph, infrared camera, and my trusty collection of sample bags and rock hammers. Mia could play ghost hunter all she wanted. I had real work to do. Trevor leaned against the RV, arms crossed. "You sure it's safe to park here? I heard people have gotten lost around these trails." "It's fine," I said without looking up. "Just don't wander off." The first night, the lights appeared like clockwork. We were sitting on camp chairs outside the RV, bundled in jackets as the temperature dropped. The forest around us was dead silent, the kind of quiet that makes you strain to hear something, anything. Mia was setting up her camera when she gasped. "There," she pointed. At first, I thought it was a trick of my eyes, but there they were. Faint, glowing orbs hovering near the treetops in the distance. They moved slowly, almost lazily, before darting out of sight behind the trees. "They're smaller than I expected," Trevor said, squinting, "but real, I guess." Mia was already filming. "Jess, what do you think? UFOs? Spirits? The ghosts of Civil War soldiers?" "Ball lightning," I said flatly, though I felt a flicker of unease. "Or swamp gas. Maybe even static electricity from tectonic activity. There's always an explanation." "Party pooper," Mia teased, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. Her camera stayed trained on the horizon, waiting for the lights to return. Things started going wrong the next morning. I woke up to find my compass spinning uselessly, its needle never settling. Trevor's phone refused to turn on, even though it was fully charged the night before. Mia's camera, her prized possession, refused to save the footage she'd taken. We blamed cheap equipment and user error, but the coincidences stacked up fast. While Mia sulked over her broken tech, I decided to collect samples from the surrounding area. The rocks I chipped from the base of the overlook were heavier than expected, their cores oddly warm to the touch. A magnetic anomaly, I thought, trying to keep my excitement in check. It had to be something geological. That night, Mia wanted to hike closer to where we'd seen the lights. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Trevor came along, though he kept looking over his shoulder like someone, or something, was following us. The lights were waiting for us. This time they weren't distant. They flickered between the trees, pulsating faintly like they were alive. Mia crept forward, her camera raised, ignoring my hissed warnings to stay back. Then I saw the first shadow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a trick of the light. But as the orbs moved, it followed, a humanoid figure that seemed to melt into the darkness around it. I froze. "Mia, get back," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why?" she asked, her attention still on the lights. "There's something there." She turned, and her expression shifted from excitement to fear. "Oh my God," she breathed, stepping back toward us. Trevor grabbed her arm. "We're leaving now." The shadows didn't chase us as we scrambled back to the RV, but they didn't need to. Their presence lingered, oppressive and suffocating, long after we'd locked ourselves inside. Mia went missing the next night. It started with an argument. I'd been adamant about staying in the RV, but Mia, ever reckless, was determined to get closer to the lights. Trevor sided with me, but that only made her more stubborn. "Fine," she snapped, grabbing her flashlight. "You two can sit here and sulk. I'll be back in an hour." She didn't come back. By the time we realized something was wrong, it was well past midnight. Trevor and I searched the immediate area, calling her name until our voices cracked, but there was no sign of her. Her flashlight lay abandoned on the ground, the bulb shattered. The lights flickered in the distance, taunting us. By dawn, Trevor and I were barely speaking. He accused me of not stopping Mia, while I blamed him for not being more forceful. But beneath the anger, we were both terrified. "Did you hear that?" Trevor asked suddenly. "What?" I snapped. "It's her, Mia." He started toward the woods, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't be stupid," I said. "That's not her." The whispers came again, faint but unmistakable. They sounded like Mia, but distorted, like her voice was being dragged through water. Trevor's eyes widened in panic. "She's out there, Jess. We have to help her." "It's not her," I said firmly. "It's them, whatever they are." Trevor didn't listen. He broke free of my grip and ran toward the sound. Cursing, I grabbed my flashlight and followed. The trail led us to a clearing where the lights converged, swirling like fireflies caught in a storm. In the center stood the figure, the shadow. It was taller now, its form more distinct, though its edges wavered like smoke. It didn't have eyes, but I felt it watching us. "Mia!" Trevor shouted, taking a step forward. "Stop!" I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "It's not her. Look!" The shadow flickered, its form shifting until it resembled Mia. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought it was her. But then the shadow smiled, a cruel, alien expression that didn't belong to her face. Trevor froze, his body trembling. I don't understand." "It's feeding on us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "On our fear." The shadow stepped closer, its elongated arms reaching for Trevor. Desperate, I dropped to my knees and started carving one of the symbols we'd seen into the dirt with a rock. "What are you doing?" Trevor asked, his voice shaking. "Trust me," I snapped, etching the final line. The moment I finished, the clearing erupted with light. The shadow let out an ear-splitting shriek, its form dissolving into darkness as the light scattered. Trevor and I bolted, running until our lungs burned and the RV came into view. Mia was lying near the RV, unconscious but alive. We carried her inside, locking the door behind us. When she woke, she didn't remember anything, just flashes of darkness and the feeling of being lost. The RV wouldn't start until I threw out one of my geological samples, which had begun glowing faintly in the light of day. As soon as it hit the ground, the engine roared to life. We didn't look back as we drove away. Mia posted a video about our trip, but she edited out the worst of it, calling it a fun, spooky adventure. Trevor dropped out of school and stopped answering my calls. I tried to forget, to bury what we saw, but some nights I still hear the whispers. The lights of Brown Mountain aren't just a phenomenon, they're a warning, and some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Camping in the backwoods of Croatan National Forest was supposed to be an adventure, an escape from the grind of life, a chance to reconnect with nature and, hopefully, with each other. At least, that's what I told Jake when I convinced him to come along. He wasn't much of an outdoorsman, not like me, but I could see the tension between us had been growing over the last few months, and I thought maybe a couple of nights in the woods would do us good. It didn't take long for things to start going sideways. The first night was a disaster. Jake, in his attempt to contribute, had picked up a bargain bin tent that leaked like a sieve when the rain hit. We spent the better part of the night curled up on damp sleeping bags, shivering in the cold, our mood as soggy as the ground beneath us. The flashlight died halfway through setting up camp, and Jake didn't have spare batteries. Typical. I could feel the frustration bubbling under my skin, but I bit my tongue. This was supposed to be a bonding trip, not another argument. By the time we woke the next morning, I was already feeling drained. Jake, ever the optimist, flashed me a lopsided grin. "Well," he said, squeezing water out of his socks, "it can't get worse, right?" I managed a weak smile, though I wasn't so sure. The Nusiak Trail wound deep into the forest, and the further we hiked, the quieter it got. I'd read somewhere that Croatan National Forest was known for its eerie stillness, but experiencing it firsthand was another thing entirely. The usual sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were muted, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. By the time we set up camp that evening, I was on edge, though I couldn't say why. The clearing Jake had picked was uneven, the trees surrounding it dense and close. As we built a fire, the shadows seemed to press in on us, flickering and shifting with the flames. Jake tried to lighten the mood with one of his lame jokes, but his voice sounded small, swallowed up by the woods. We ate in relative silence, and when the fire began to die, we crawled into the tent. That's when I heard it. The first whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, almost melodic sound drifting through the trees, but as I strained to listen, it became clearer. Voices, too faint to make out the words, but unmistakably human. I sat up, heart pounding. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "Hear what?" "The voices." He sat up, rubbing his eyes. We both froze, straining to listen. The whispers were gone. "You're just spooking yourself," he said, lying back down. "Go to sleep." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The next morning, Jake found the first marking. It was carved into a tree near our tent, a strange symbol that looked almost like a twisted star. He pointed it out, joking about wannabe witches, but his laugh felt forced. I didn't say anything, but the sight of it left me uneasy. Things went missing after that. Small stuff at first, a pocket knife I always kept in my bag, Jake's hat. I figured we'd misplaced them in the chaos of setting up camp, but when the knife reappeared later, sitting neatly on a rock outside the tent, my stomach turned. Jake tried to shrug it off, but I could see the tension in his jaw. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, circling our camp. Jake and I sat by the dying fire, straining to hear, but the voices never got close enough to make out. Just soft, teasing murmurs that seemed to melt into the night air. Then they started mimicking us. I heard my own voice, faint and distorted, calling Jake's name from somewhere in the woods. My blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale. It sounded like, "You." We stayed up for hours, clutching sticks like weapons, but nothing came out of the darkness. By the time dawn broke, the voices were gone, but their echo lingered in my mind. Jake wanted to leave. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at the trail, his nervous energy barely contained. But the map and compass were gone, and without them we had no way of navigating the maze of trees around us. Our phones had mysteriously died overnight, despite being fully charged when we went to bed. Jake swore he saw someone, me, standing at the edge of the clearing, though I was sitting by the fire at the time. When he looked again, the figure was gone. That afternoon we found more markings carved into the trees in a rough circle around our camp. They were all variations of the same twisted star, their lines jagged and uneven, as if made by clawed hands. By the time night fell, the tension between us had reached a breaking point. "This is your fault," Jake snapped as we sat by the fire, the shadows stretching long and thin around us. "You just had to drag us out here, didn't you? Couldn't settle for a normal trip, no, it had to be the middle of nowhere." "Don't put this on me," I shot back. "You wanted to come, remember? No one forced you." "Maybe I shouldn't have," he muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I opened my mouth to respond, but a sound stopped me cold. It was laughter. High and cruel, echoing from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The sound carried a distortion, like it was layered with something deeper, darker. We both froze, our argument forgotten. Then I saw her. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, her limbs too long for her body. Her face was a shifting blur, as though she couldn't quite decide what she wanted to look like. Her eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce the darkness. The witch. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough. The air around us seemed to thicken, heavy with a malevolence that made my skin crawl. Jake grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The witch tilted her head as if amused. Then she shifted, her form flickering, and suddenly she was me. I gasped, staring at my own face, twisted into a cruel mockery of my features. Jake's grip on the branch faltered, and I saw the fear in his eyes. The witch's mouth twisted into a grin, her voice a perfect mimicry of mine. "Jake," she whispered, "you can't protect her." Jake lunged, swinging the branch wildly. I tried to stop him, but his panic made him clumsy. The witch dodged easily, her laughter ringing through the clearing. In his desperation, Jake turned too quickly, the branch catching me across the temple. I woke up alone. The clearing was empty, the fire nothing more than smoldering embers. My head throbbed, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. But the markings on the trees, the whispers in the wind, they were all too real. "Jake?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Panic set in as I searched the woods, my calls growing more frantic. I found him an hour later, standing in a trance-like state at the base of a massive tree. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his lips moving soundlessly. "Jake?" I grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Wake up!" His gaze flickered, his focus snapping back to me. "Emily?" "We have to go," I said, pulling him toward the trail. "Now." The witch appeared one last time, blocking our path. Her form was more solid now, her features sharper. She reached for Jake, her fingers impossibly long, curling toward him like talons. I don't know what possessed me, but I remembered the markings we'd seen, the symbols carved into the trees. Grabbing a stick, I dropped to my knees, frantically carving one into the dirt. The witch let out a piercing scream, her form flickering and distorting. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and for a moment I thought the world itself would tear apart. Then she was gone. We stumbled out of the forest at dawn, our legs weak and our minds reeling. Neither of us spoke as we loaded our gear into the car, leaving the cursed woods behind. I still don't know what we encountered in Croatan, but one thing is certain. Some stories aren't just stories, and some places are better left alone.